They carved their silence into the stone, and the wind has been singing it ever since. Tonight we will live a life in the wind-worn battlements of the Scottish highlands, where jagged cliffs cradled the mists like a child never meant to wake, and ruined towers stand as hollowed-out lungs breathing centuries of forgotten prayers. Here banners once flew, their colours swallowed by storms, and voices once thundered through stone halls, now emptied into echoes. Every stone bears the fingerprint of those who fought and those who fell, those who loved and those who left there. Names to the wind. In this land, history is not written in books, but carved into the marrow of rock, sung in the cry of ravens, and whispered through the heather. Leave your whisper in the comments, and if this story speaks to you, light a candle with a like. Now, get comfortable. The past is waiting. The highlands rise like an old hymn, their slopes veiled in mist, their silence held taut as though the land itself remembers what men have long forgotten. And at the heart of that silence lie the battlements, weathered not only by stones, slow crumbling, but by centuries of wind that seem to know every secret of the clans who bled to keep these walls standing. These fortresses were not mere dwellings, they were prayers cast upward, towers reaching toward the sky as if begging the heavens to notice. And within their shadow one can still feel the pulse of lives long extinguished, the warmth of fires that once glowed within halls now dark, and the sorrow of voices that once rose in song, broken by the clangor of war. The battlements do not shout their story, they do not rage, they endure, patient and grave, carrying in their stones the weight of oath and betrayal, of feasts that ended in famine, of victories that turned to ash. And when the wind moves through their shattered arches, it is as if the centuries themselves breathe, reminding those who listen that memory does not die. It merely waits for ears willing to hear, long before the highlands were draped in romantic mist by poets and travelers. These walls knew the coarse smell of sweat and iron. They knew the restless stirrings of horses penned beneath wooden roofs, the leather creak of saddles, the muted thud of practiced swords, the low murmur of prayers whispered to saints whose names were etched into chapel stones. These castles were born not out of vanity but necessity, for here the land was harsh, the rivalries sharper than the cliffs that cut the sea. Every family clung to its honor like a flame flickering against the storm. Each clan bound by blood, yet torn apart by feuds that ran deeper than rivers. And the battlements rose as shields, as promises to protect kin and keep strangers at bay. Stones dragged and stacked by hands blistered raw, mortared with sweat and the unspoken belief that walls could outlast time itself. The wind, however, has never ceased its patient work, carrying with it the cry of curlew and raven, carrying the taste of salt from distant seas, wearing at the stones the way grief wears at the heart. Soft and endless, these walls stood through centuries of change, yet even as lords fell and banners faded, the wind remained faithful. It circled towers like a priest walking cloisters, chanting not in words but in currents of cold and hush, preserving memory in movement, and in this ceaseless caress, the battlements became not merely ruins, but reliquaries, their very decay a kind of liturgy, a prayer carved in erosion, reminding all who pass that nothing built by man can withstand the hunger of time, yet everything touched by devotion lingers, if only as dust, if only as a whisper in the gall. To walk these highlands today is to walk through shadows that do not vanish in daylight. For every stone is a ghost, every field a page inked with lives that unfolded and closed long before the modern world began. Sheep graze where blood once soaked the earth, Heather sways where banners once fell. The air is sharp and cold, yet within it lies a warmth, a presence, as though those who came before still linger, their hands still clutching the battlements, their eyes still watching the passers, their silence heavy but not empty. It is the silence of stories too deep to be told in full, stories that can only be felt in the marrow when one stands before walls battered and broken, yet still somehow upright. The clans who built these fortresses understood that permanence was an illusion, yet they sought it all the same, carving their names into stone, binding their lineages to earth and sky. And though wars consumed their sons and treaties dissolved their lands, the battlements endured as markers of defiance, each scar upon them a testament, each collapsed stair a reminder. Here feasts were held with laughter spilling into night. Here children ran barefoot across flagstones, their voices ringing against high vaults. Here lovers met in shadowed corners, their whispers softer than the wind. And here too steel clashed, and torches cast long shivering lights over men who would not see another dawn. All of it folded now into silence, yet silence alive with memory. There is a strange sanctity in ruin. For what crumbles is not erased, it is transformed, and these highlands are a cathedral of such sanctity, their battlements like altars, their valleys like aisles where fog drifts in procession. Bells no longer toll here, yet one can almost hear them in the rustle of leaves, the beat of wings, the hush that descends before rain. Every fragment of wall is a psalm, every shattered arch a hymn. And when one places a hand upon cold stone worn smooth by centuries of storm, it is as though touching the pulse of those who came before. As though the boundary between now and then has thinned, and you too have become part of the long remembering history. Here is not tidy, it is jagged, it is mournful, it is tender in its ferocity. For these battlements sheltered children, even as they prepared men for slaughter. They guarded treasures of faith, even as they burned with heresy. They stood proud, under kings and humbled under conquerors. Yet through it all, they became something greater than function, greater than architecture. They became symbols, monuments not to power, but to endurance, not to wealth, but to the inevitability of loss. And perhaps this is why they still move us. Because we too are fragile. We to build walls against storms we cannot master. And we to hope that some part of us will remain when the wind has taken everything else in. So the battlements of the Scottish Highlands stand, ragged, weary, yet unbroken. Their stones a chronicle written without ink, their silence a language older than words. They do not ask us to mourn, they ask us to listen, to understand that within their decay lies a truth more lasting than grandeur. That life, no matter how fierce, yields to time, yet in yielding leaves. Behind a beauty only the patient can see, the wind sings this truth every day, carrying across valleys and lochs, across cliffs and moors, a song that has no beginning and no end, a song that reminds us that history is not behind us but within us, alive in the stones, alive in the air, alive in the endless whisper of the highlands. The morning fog clings to the highlands like a memory that refuses to fade, wrapping each cliff, each narrow pass, and each broken tower in a veil of silver sorrow. The battlements rise through it, grim and patient, their edges softened by centuries of rain and wind. Yet every crack and crumbling parapet speaks with clarity to those who pause, to those who remember, and even the stones seem to exhale the histories of men long vanished. Lords who counted seasons by the sharpening of blades, women who wove hope into tapestries now lost of flame and rot, children who chased one another over flagstones that would later bear the scars of siege. Every gesture, every fleeting laughter, every quiet prayer absorbed into the marrow of the walls, until the very air vibrates with the weight of absence, as though the wind itself has learned to carry memory as surely as it carries the salt from the distant sea. Here, the paths that wind between battlements are lined not with flowers, but with shadow, the heather and bracken whispering to one another in a language older than names, and footsteps of the living disturb only lightly the sleep of the dead, for the earth has absorbed more sorrow than any man can reckon, yet it gives it back in fragments, in glimmers, in sensations that brush the skin like the soft wings of a raven. And standing on a ruined wall, one sees the folds of the land below, the locks catching sunlight as if to hold it still, the rivers tracing silver veins through stone and moss, and one senses the endurance of the people who once walked here, how they moved with gravity and grace, how they laughed and wept under the same sky, how they understood the fragility of life and the stubbornness of love, and how every choice, every betrayal, every act of courage has been absorbed into the bones of the highlands themselves. The battles that tore these walls echo still, though the sound has been softened by time, replaced with a mournful rhythm in the wind. The clash of steel, now a vibration beneath the soles of your feet. The cries of men and the weeping of women resonating in hollow arches and collapsed stairwells. History does not merely recount these things, it inhabits them. It folds itself around you, and you become part of it without realizing. The banners that once proclaimed allegiance have long rotted, the shields lie buried or broken. Yet the spirit of defiance lingers, not loud but persistent, like the slow pulse of a drum felt beneath the earth. And in that pulse, one understands the duality of these walls. They are both prison and sanctuary, both witness and participant, holding all that happened and all that could have happened. A constant tension between the fleeting and the eternal. Every stone here is carved by labor and devotion, sometimes by desperation, sometimes by hope. And the hands that shaped them are long gone, yet their presence persists, faint but undeniable. It is in the tiny chips of rock that fell from a mason's hammer, in the faint inscriptions scratched by children's fingers, in the subtle indentations of shields pressed too long against parapets. And as the wind moves through the battlements, brushing against weathered towers and collapsed roofs, it reads these signs as if they were scripture, translating them into sighs and whispers. And if one listens closely, one can feel the weight of generations passing, of seasons folding upon themselves, of lives intersecting with lives now only remembered in the motion of grass and the cry of a lone bird overhead. Dusk, the highlands take on a hue that seems drawn from another world. The cliffs turning deep violet, the locks reflecting a bruised sky, the battlements casting shadows that stretch long and solemn over the land. And in this light, the history becomes almost tangible. One can imagine the figures that once roamed these stones, their breath misting in the chill, their fingers tracing runes and knots in stone as prayers, their eyes scanning the horizon for friend and foe alike. The wind carries faint scents of smoke and iron, mingled with the sweetness of heather. And in that blend, one experiences a kind of clarity, the fragile, beautiful realization that nothing is truly lost. It merely persists in form less visible, waiting for those willing to perceive it, willing to place a hand upon the stone and feel the pulse of 1,000 lives beneath their fingertips. The battlements witnessed more than battles. They saw rituals, ceremonies, farewells whispered in corridors, and embraces held tight against the inevitability of absence. A mother's gaze lingering on a departing son, a lover's touch trembling in the dark, a priest's hand tracing crosses. In candlelight, all of it etched into memory so deeply that even time cannot wash it away. Every scar in stone carries its echo. Every fallen turret is a testament. Every arch that leans against the sky is a monument to endurance. And in this endurance, there is a sacred melancholy, a beauty born of survival through grief. And those who walk here today find themselves tracing the invisible outlines of such moments, sensing the intangible weight of loyalty, fear, joy, and despair. Learning that history is not merely recounted, it is felt in marrow and breath. It resides not in books, but in stone, wind, and silence. Night brings a different intimacy, a quieting that is both gentle and profound. The stars reflected in still locks, the moon spilling silver across broken battlements, and every shadow seems to hold a story. The faint rustle of nocturnal creatures reminding the visitor that life continues, that memory is not static, that the past and present converse in secret, and as the wind sweeps over the ridges, it carries fragments of song, of chant, of laughter, of sobbing, of battle cries, weaving them into a tapestry only those who stop and breathe can perceive. It is not frightening, nor ghostly. It is sacred, a reminder that time's passage cannot erase meaning, that endurance is itself a kind of immortality, and in this moment, one can feel that they are not alone, that every stone has its story, every arch its witness, and every breeze its voice in the cold that settles upon the battlements. There is a clarity, a stripping away of all superficialities, leaving only the essential: stone, wind, sky, and memory. And one becomes aware of the cyclical nature of existence, how families rose and fell, how love persisted amid loss, how courage and despair intertwined endlessly, and how the highland wind, relentless yet tender, moves as if in remembrance, carrying the weight of centuries through gorges and over cliffs, whispering to those who listen, reminding all who wander here that every moment of life, every act of creation or destruction, leaves a mark that, though invisible to most, resonates endlessly with the universe. The battlements stand not merely as relics, but as vessels of that resonance. So, as one descends from the towers, the battlements receding behind like ancient sentinels, the impression remains. A gentle insistence that the past is alive, that it has never truly gone, that the wind-worn stones continue to speak. And if one listens, one can hear the prayers of mothers and fathers, the cries of warriors, the laughter of children, the whispers of lovers, all mingled with the wind and woven into the fabric of the highlands. And it becomes clear that these walls, though broken, are whole in memory, their endurance a mirror to our own impermanence. And the landscape itself seems to hum with quiet reverence. The highlands, a living cathedral where the wind is the organ and the stones are the sacred choir, singing the endless story of humanity in the hush of mist and shadow. The light that creeps over the highlands in the early morning is slow and diffident, slipping across jagged peaks and fallen towers as though reluctant to disturb the memories they guard. And in that gentle illumination, the battlements appear both fragile and enduring, each stone a heartbeat in the rhythm of centuries, scarred by frost, rain, and wind, yet steadfast, as if the land itself refuses to forget the lives that once pressed against it. The warriors who traced corridors with armored boots, the women who carried water from distant springs to kitchens now collapsed into rubble, the children who stumbled over uneven flagstones, leaving small imprints in mud that hardened into a silent record. All of it layered one upon another until the present feels like a thin veil over a deeper, more tangible history, a history that exhales softly with every gust that dances through shattered arches and moss-covered parapets. The battlements were both guardians and witnesses, standing sentinel over valleys where smoke once rose from hearths, where the scent of bread mingled with that of iron and wet earth, where the wind carried the laughter of families and the whispered strategies of men preparing for war. The air was thick with devotion and tension alike, every corner a place of sacred ritual, every turret a perch from which to watch over life and death. And yet, despite the violence and fear, there was tenderness, moments of unrecorded grace. A hand pressed to a lover's shoulder in the dim of dawn, a mother murmuring words of hope to a frightened child. The soft exhalation of prayer before a candle's flame, and these ephemeral gestures have seeped into the stone, infusing it with a delicate, mournful warmth, so that even centuries later, one can feel the faint pulse of human longing beneath the cold granite. The wind-worn battlements speak in whispers that only those who are patient can discern, and these whispers carry fragments of lives to icily forgotten, telling of men who kept watch through storm and frost, whose breath rose in clouds against bitter winds, whose fingers grew numb upon stone yet never faltered in their vigilance, and of women who waited in kitchens and chambers, tending fires and gardens, preserving lineages in spite of hardship, teaching children to navigate the unforgiving landscape, comforting the dying, celebrating the born, all under the ceaseless gaze of the mountains, the air thick with memory. The smell of wet stone and pine needles, a reminder that life persisted, unremarkable yet heroic. Amid the grandeur and terror of the battlements' enduring presences, one walks the narrow passages that thread through towers and courtyards. The interplay of light and shadow casts visions that feel like half-remembered dreams, glimpses of figures in period attire, hands resting on railings, cloaks trailing across stone, eyes scanning the horizon with hope or fear, every gesture imbued with purpose and history. And though these specters are not literal, they emerge in the imagination as faithfully as if the past were tangible. The battlements themselves, a kind of memory machine, translating centuries into sensations. A subtle vibration beneath the skin, a faint echo in the ear, a soft impression of footsteps that have long since faded, teaching those who walk there that time is porous, that past and present can coexist, and that attention and reverence allow the fleeting to become eternal. The history of the highlands is woven not just in stone, but in the terrain itself, in the heathered hills that rise and fall like waves frozen mid-motion, in the craggy cliffs that plunge into mist, in the locks that mirror the sky and the clouds, all elements conspiring to hold memory, to preserve echoes of what once was. And the battlements exist in dialogue with the land, their stones drinking in wind and rain, absorbing frost and sun alike, recording the ebb and flow of seasons, the passage of life, the cycle of human endeavor, and even the simplest act passing through a broken doorway, leaning against a weathered wall, connects the present visitor with countless moments of joy, fear, ambition, and despair, binding all who come with an invisible thread of remembrance within these walls. Time behaves differently. It folds upon itself, and one senses the layering of lives in the shadows, in the worn staircases, in the way the sunlight splinters through crumbling battlements, scattering gold and rust across cold stone, the air charged with invisible presence, as if the living and the dead exist side by side, each aware of the other, each shaping the other's perception. And here, amid such silent witness, one feels both immense humility and profound connection, understanding that to walk these halls, is to bear witness oneself, to become a temporary vessel for all the stories the stones have stored, to inhale the sorrow and the beauty that endured centuries and yet remains, poised delicately in each gust of wind. In every shimmer of mist, the endurance of these battlements is mirrored in the resilience of those who inhabited them, the clans, who fought for survival, for honor, for land, for lineage. And the cost of that survival is written into every crack, every toppled wall, every collapsed stair. Yet there is dignity in it, a quiet majesty, a testament to lives fully lived despite fragility and loss. And in contemplating this, one realizes the battlements are not merely ruins. They are living memorials, teaching those who approach them to see endurance as sacred, loss as instructive, and memory as a force stronger than conquest or decay. For though the banners have long since rotted and the swords have crumbled to rust, the essence of these people persists in the stone and the wind, a testimony that presence need not be visible to be real. The battlements, though scarred and fragmented, guide the eye and the mind toward contemplation, their arches framing vistas, where valleys stretch to the horizon, where mist gathers in folds like fabric draped over hills, where locks catch glimmers of dawn. And in such a frame, one can see not only the land, but the living energy of all who moved upon it. The sweep of hands, the weight of gaze, the unspoken pacts between clans and kin, the small intimacies hidden amid the great dramas of history, all of it lingering in the very air. The air charged with past deeds and quiet sorrows, carrying an almost tangible resonance that awakens awareness, fostering a sense of reverence for lives that were ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, and for the endurance of the structures that cradled the land. When evening falls, the highlands enter, a realm of soft shadows and subtle light, the battlements transformed into silhouettes against fading violet and amber skies, the wind sighing through crenellations like an organ playing a single sustained note, the smell of damp stone and bracken rising from the earth. And in that fragile, transient hour, one can almost feel the heartbeat of history, slow and unyielding, urging attention and care, reminding the observer that every life mattered, every decision left its mark, that the battlements are not merely reminders of the past but invitations to honor it, to pause, to breathe, to recognize that human existence, fleeting though it may be, leaves impressions that wind and stone carry forward into eternity. The highlands themselves, cradling these ruins, act as custodians, the hills and rivers amplifying the voices of the past, the locks reflecting light that seems almost consecrated, the cliffs absorbing wind and rain with patient endurance, and the battlements, like patient sentinels, channel these elements into a story beyond words, a story felt in every fiber of one's being, an intimate communion with generations long gone, so that when one finally descends from the towers into the heathered fields below, a quiet transformation has occurred, a subtle yet profound alignment with the past, a recognition that though men fall and stones crumble, memory, reverence, and human endeavor ripple through time like the persistent highland wind. Twilight settles over the highlands like a soft shroud, curling through valleys, slipping into ruined halls, and spilling over battlements that have endured storm and siege for centuries. The light washes the stone with muted amber, casting long, contemplative shadows that stretch across moss-covered steps and fractured parapets. And in this stillness, the presence of the past feels close, almost tangible, as though one can sense the weight of footsteps that have long vanished, the quiet murmur of voices once raised in celebration, in mourning, in strategy, the echo of laughter fading into the mist, and the wind carries these fragments as if they were prayers, scattering them across the hills, mixing with the scent of wet earth and pine, reminding all who linger that memory is alive and persistent, woven into every crevice, every fissure, every weathered stone. The battlements themselves are more than mere remnants. They are vessels of human aspiration and grief, each scar upon their surfaces a testament to courage and suffering, to fleeting triumphs and inevitable loss. And as the eye traces the crumbling edges of towers and ramparts, it is impossible not to feel the intimate connection between land and life, the symbiosis of survival and memory, the rhythm of existence measured not in years but in the cycles of building and falling, of hands lifting stones and later brushing away moss, of prayers whispered for those who would never return, the cadence of life and death echoing through corridors and courtyards, pressing upon the soul like the gentle insistence of wind through a hollowed arch. Here, in the quiet hours, one can almost perceive the subtler moments that history often neglects, the intimate gestures of ordinary people whose stories are absorbed by stone and fog, the softness of a mother's voice coaxing a child awake to the dawn, the tender touch of a hand held in solace after a day of battle, the careful folding of a letter that would never reach its intended, the unrecorded prayers muttered before a candle flickers and dies. All these ephemeral acts left behind not as records but as impressions, as whispers in the wind, as faint vibrations in the walls. And to witness them is to feel the past pressing against the present, subtle and mournful, a reminder that human life is fragile yet capable of leaving traces that endure beyond mortality. The wind moves through the battlements with a gentle insistence, threading its way through broken arches, narrow staircases, and collapsed towers, as if intent on reading aloud all that the stones have accumulated. The sigh of air over jagged edges carrying the essence of toil, laughter, fear, and devotion. The echo of distant footsteps pressing against the ear like soft heartbeats, and one realizes that the highlands themselves are living memory, shaped and sustained by the intersection of human endeavor and elemental force, the land remembering the stories it has held, and offering them back to anyone patient enough to listen, to walk slowly, to pause at a window where the sun slants through a fractured wall, to feel the chill that lingers like a shadow of ancient resolve. The battlements are repositories of time's sacred geometry, towers aligned not only for defense but to command perspective, to frame the horizon, to remind those within of the vastness of the land and the narrowness of their own existence. And as one climbs their worn stairs, placing hands upon stones smoothed by centuries of touch, one senses the accumulation of human presence, the layering of ambition and humility, of pride and grief, the quiet ritual of survival repeated endlessly, each generation leaving only what it can hold on to before surrendering the rest to wind and rain. Yet even in this surrender there is beauty, a testament to the dignity inherent in endurance, to the reverence encoded in effort, to the subtle sanctity of the ordinary evenings. Here are suffused with a melancholic grace, the long shadows painting the battlements in hues of violet and copper, the wind moving in hushed currents over parapets and through gaps in walls, carrying the faint scent of smoke and iron from fires long extinguished. And in this hour, imagination blends seamlessly with memory, conjuring figures frozen in motion, hands reaching, eyes scanning horizons, the delicate press of fingers upon stone, the sigh of a lover released too soon, the whispered promise to return, all woven into the atmosphere, all pressing gently upon the heart, teaching that every act, however small, becomes part of the tapestry of endurance, of memory, of life itself. The architecture, though broken, is eloquent. Each fragment a message, each collapse a lesson. The curves of arches and jagged edges of walls, tracing the passage of generations, guiding the gaze outward to distant mountains, reflecting the care and intent of those who shaped the stones with hands raw from labor yet tender with devotion. The battlements are as much spiritual as physical spaces, places where the finite and infinite converge, where fleeting human lives intersect with the ceaseless march of wind and weather, where silence itself becomes a medium for communication, where every observer participates in a sacred exchange, receiving stories imprinted in material and air. And in that exchange, the visitor becomes part of the history, a temporary steward of memory at nightfall. The highlands battlements are cloaked in a soft darkness that invites introspection, the wind threading like a hymn through collapsed parapets, the locks reflecting faint pinpricks of starlight, the mossed stones exhaling the accumulated warmth of human life. And one feels both humility and wonder, sensing that the land, the battlements, and the people who inhabited them are inseparable in a sacred continuity, that every scar, every shard of masonry, every worn threshold carries meaning, and that though centuries have passed, the essence of these lives persists in quiet, unassuming ways, urging remembrance, reverence, and a kind of spiritual attentiveness. The highlands teach patience, endurance, and reverence, and the battlements are their instruments, their voices, their memorials, and as one lingers on parapets, tracing the outlines of towers against the darkening sky, the wind carrying whispers of long-gone footsteps, one understands that human fragility does not diminish significance, that life's impermanence is not failure but a vital thread in the sacred continuity of memory, that every gesture, every breath, every quiet endurance is a note in the ongoing hymn of history, resonating softly in stone, air, and imagination, a resonance that endures long after the bodies have returned to earth. And so, the wind-worn battlements of the Scottish Highlands hold their vigil still, patient, sacred, their stories pressed into stone and air, waiting for ears willing to hear, hearts willing to feel, hands willing to touch, the wind carrying the weight of centuries, not as lament but as an invitation to witness, to remember, to honor, to become part of the silent song that links past and present in a continuum of reverence and awe, reminding all who pause that the grandeur of life is measured not by permanence but by the depth of care, devotion, and presence imprinted upon each fleeting moment. The highlands at dawn are cloaked in a delicate frost that glistens upon the battlements, turning each stone into a prism for the faint pink light of morning. And in this fragile brilliance, one can sense the careful layering of centuries, the quiet endurance of lives woven into the walls, the unseen presence of those who built, defended, and cherished these places. Each act of courage and tenderness pressed into granite like a subtle heartbeat, the wind tracing over surfaces smoothed by human hands, carrying with it the faint scent of peat smoke and heather, a gentle reminder that memory inhabits the spaces where life once thrived, and that the ruins themselves are repositories not only of history but of feeling, fragile yet eternal. Luminous in the hush of morning within these battlements, every corner holds a narrative, every collapsed turret a silent testament to hope and loss. The hallways once bustling with life, now emptied into quiet. Yet their emptiness is not void. It is full of resonance, vibrating with the echoes of footsteps. The soft creak of doors, the hushed murmur of conversations carried on the wind, the laughter of children running over flagstones, now chipped and worn, the sorrow of mothers watching sons depart, of lovers clutching hands before parting, all pressed into the fabric of stone and mortar, absorbed into the very architecture, so that to walk these passages is to move through a living chronicle, every step a delicate communion with lives long past. Yet present in the subtle pulse beneath the soles of the feet, the battlements were witnesses to the human paradox, where love and violence coexisted, where tenderness mingled with cruelty, where hope and despair were inseparable companions. And the stones themselves hold this duality, each scar a mark of both protection and destruction, each arch a frame for both beauty and suffering. The wind carrying these layered meanings across ramparts and over moors, brushing the visitor with impressions of courage, fear, longing, and devotion, teaching that the history of a place is never singular, but a mosaic of innumerable private truths, fleeting glances, whispered promises, silent prayers, and the invisible gestures that define the arc of human existence, shaping the soul of the battlements as surely as the storm shapes the cliffs. To linger in the courtyards is to feel the rhythm of the past in the present, the cycles of life unfolding repeatedly, children racing across stone, animals moving with quiet persistence, soldiers training under the watchful eyes of elders, women tending gardens or fires, every motion absorbed into the memory of stone, the wind carrying fragments like invisible ink, leaving them imprinted upon the observer. And in this interplay of permanence and impermanence, one recognizes a sacred pattern, the repetition of human experience across generations, the enduring need to protect, to nurture, to remember, and the subtle intimacy of existence imprinted on everything from the smallest flagstone to the tallest tower, all of it animated by invisible currents of devotion and Karevan in ruin. The battlements express a profound dignity, their jagged edges tracing the silhouette of resilience against a sky that shifts from gold to grey, the wind moving through broken crenellations like an unseen hand smoothing rough edges, carrying with it the soft scent of rain-soaked earth and pine, and in that scent one feels the persistence of life even in decay, the quiet beauty of survival despite loss, the sacredness of ordinary gestures, the endurance of memory that transforms absence into presence. For though the voices that once filled these halls have long fallen silent, their echoes remain, imbued in the stone, in the wind, in the mist that drifts through parapets and courtyards. A subtle, mournful hymn of human persistence. The battlements are more than architecture. They are vessels of identity, of memory, of collective experience, and one senses that the men and women who inhabited them understood their own fragility, their own impermanence, yet sought to leave traces of care and devotion that could endure. The careful laying of stones, the carving of inscriptions, the maintenance of walls against relentless weather, all acts both practical and symbolic, gestures meant to anchor fleeting human life against the vast, indifferent sweep of time. And the wind, ever faithful, carries these gestures onward, whispering them into the folds of the highlands, scattering them across valleys and lochs, folding them into the rhythm of earth and sky as the day progresses. Light transforms the battlements into a living tableau, shadows shifting across collapsed staircases, the frost melting to reveal the subtle textures of stone, the wind moving in currents that lift small particles of dust and moss, turning them into delicate motes that shimmer like faint stars against the ruins. And in this luminous transience, one senses the continuity of human effort, the tenderness and devotion embedded in every stone. The endurance of memory carried by wind and weather alike, the sacredness of persistence, and the delicate, mournful beauty that arises when life's fragility is acknowledged and honored. Each moment a small eternity pressed into the texture of stone, and air evenings bring a different intimacy. The battlements glowing softly beneath a copper sky, wind threading like a chant through towers and collapsed walls, locks reflecting twilight in muted silvers. And in that hour, one perceives the invisible threads connecting generations, the lives that unfolded within the walls, the choices and sacrifices, the quiet heroism of everyday endurance, all resonating in the material and the atmosphere, teaching that history is neither absent nor silent, but persistent, alive in the air, the stone, the wind, waiting for those who can perceive it, for those willing to touch, to pause, to acknowledge, to remember. The highland battlements, despite their decay, are sacred spaces, their architecture infused with the human pulse of generations. Each scar, each collapse, each weathered stone a subtle testament. And as one moves among them, senses sharpen, awareness heightens, memory awakens. The wind carrying fragments of lives, whispers of devotion, shimmers of sorrow, and hints of fleeting joy, all converging into an intricate tapestry of existence, a living archive of emotion, effort, and endurance, reminding that while time may erode the visible, it cannot erase the essence of experience, and that memory, when honored, persists in whispers, in stones, in wind, in the eternal breath of the highlands. And, as night falls, cloaking the battlements in deep indigo, scattering stars across the heavens, one feels the sacred hush settle. Over the ruins, the wind moving in gentle currents through crumbled arches and empty halls, carrying the faint pulse of lives that shaped this place. And one understands that to witness these battlements is to participate in their story, to hold it gently in awareness, to honor the endurance, sorrow, and beauty that have passed into stone and air, teaching that memory is never truly lost, and that the wind, carrying centuries of devotion and human presence, continues its sacred song across the highlands, unseen yet profoundly present, guiding those who listen into reverence and quiet awe. The highlands in early morning reveal a delicate interplay of mist and sunlight, the battlements rising through fog like ancient sentinels, their edges softened by centuries yet unyielding. And within this fragile stillness, the weight of memory is almost tangible, pressing gently against the skin, filling lungs with the subtle scent of wet stone, pine, and heather, a perfume of endurance, of lives folded into earth and wind. Each stone a vessel of devotion, courage, sorrow, and hope, absorbing countless footsteps and gestures, the laughter of children, the whispered strategies of warriors, the quiet solace of families huddled together against chill and storm, all carried forward in the cadence of wind and time. The battlements, though broken, retain their dignity, their towers framing the sky and the valleys below, the wind threading through arches and stairwells with a hushed insistence, stirring fragments of memory as though calling them to attention. The echoes of human presence lingering in invisible layers, felt in the fingertips brushing cold stone, in the soles pressing worn flagstones, in the quiet pulse beneath the ribs. And one begins to understand that these walls are more than architecture. They are repositories of intention, of love and fear, of courage and despair, each fracture, each weathered edge, a testament to endurance. The sacred geometry of human persistence, preserved in stone and mortar. Every passage, every courtyard is infused with intimate histories, unnoticed gestures of life long gone, the mother smoothing a child's hair beside a hearth, the lover's hand lingering on a shoulder, the artisan hammering in rhythm with the rising sun, each act small yet resonant, pressed into the fabric of the battlements, absorbed into the stone, the wind carrying their essence outward, scattering it over hills and lochs, folding it into the rhythm of the land itself, teaching that even fleeting presence leaves an indelible mark. That memory is not recorded solely in books, but in touch, scent, and the quiet architecture of everyday life. A sacred ledger of endurance. The battlements witnessed countless separations and reunions. The thin line between joy and despair traced in every arch, every parapet, every weathered stair. And as the observer moves through their remnants, one feels the intimate weight of history, the sorrow of lives lost, the courage of those who remained, the subtle acts of heroism in tending the weak, the prayers for those who would never return, the delicate gestures of reconciliation after conflict, all layered into the stone, into the wind, into the mist that drifts endlessly through the crumbled towers, transforming absence into presence, loss into a quiet beauty, and impermanence into a sacred echo. The wind, ever vigilant, carries these narratives in currents both strong and gentle, shifting dust, moss, and fallen leaves across the battlements, scattering them like notes in a silent song, threading through broken crenellations and staircases, pressing against faces with a cool insistence, and in its movement one senses the pulse of generations, the steady rhythm of existence, the continuity of human endeavor, the sacred persistence of care and attention, the endurance of memory through time's relentless erosion, teaching that nothing devoted with intent and heart is ever truly lost. Sunlight alters the battlements as the day unfolds, casting jagged shadows across stones smoothed by centuries, highlighting cracks and chips that mark effort and care, illuminating corners where children played, where soldiers trained, where lovers whispered, where mothers knelt in prayer. And each illuminated fragment becomes a touchstone for imagination and remembrance, allowing one to reconstruct the subtle choreography of life that once animated these spaces. And in witnessing this interplay of light and shadow, one feels the profound intersection of human fragility and resilience, the beauty of endurance, the sacred persistence of memory that transforms mere stone into a living archive. The battlements speak silently of duality, of vulnerability and strength, of transience and permanence, the wind carrying whispers of moments unnoticed by history books, yet vital in shaping the essence of the place. Each scar in stone a trace of care or desperation, each collapse a narrative of adaptation, each careful repair a testament to devotion, and the observer, moving among them, absorbs this layered history not intellectually but in the skin, the breath, the heartbeat, the subtle alignment of awareness with the pulse of generations, learning that presence itself is sacred when invested with attention, care, and remembrancy. Meanings drape the highlands in muted shades of copper and violet, the battlements casting long, meditative shadows across valleys, the wind moving like a chant through broken parapets, carrying fragments of human presence, the smell of moss and wet stone rising to meet it, and one perceives the profound intimacy embedded in every corner, every arch, every collapsed wall, the gentle resonance of lives long gone, the tender balance of courage, devotion, sorrow, and fleeting joy, all vibrating subtly in the air and the observer's consciousness, reminding that memory is not static but living, fluid, and sacred, a delicate thread connecting past, present, and the unseen future. The architecture, though fractured, continues to guide the eye and the mind toward reflection, framing distant valleys, hills, lochs, and skies, emphasizing the smallness of the individual within the vast sweep of time, while simultaneously amplifying the profound significance of small gestures, acts of care, attention, devotion, and courage. The battlements acting as a conduit for both remembrance and meditation, teaching that endurance is not measured solely in survival, but in the subtle, reverent attention one brings to life, and that the sacred is found in the ongoing dialogue between human fragility and the persistence of memory as night deepens. The battlements rest beneath a blanket of starlight, the wind sighing gently through broken arches, staircases, and towers, carrying the faint pulse of human lives that shaped them. And in this hour, one feels both humility and connection, sensing the continuum of generations, the sacred interplay of presence and absence, the endurance of memory in stone and wind, the resonance of lives fully lived despite impermanence, and the quiet instruction that to witness these ruins is to participate in their history, to honor it, and to carry its essence forward, subtly, reverently, within oneself. Dawn creeps over the highlands in fragile ribbons of pale gold, slipping across battlements that have endured centuries of wind and storm, illuminating fractured towers and moss-clad parapets with a quiet reverence. And within this delicate light, the past breathes, almost audible, a faint rhythm in stone and air, the wind carrying whispers of lives that unfolded here, lives shaped by vigilance, devotion, and the unspoken rituals of survival. The scent of damp stone mingling with pine and heather, a subtle perfume that clings to memory itself, teaching that the battlements are not merely ruins, but living archives of experience. Each fissure a chapter, each arch a narrative, each fallen flagstone a verse in the hymn of existence. The courtyards and staircases hold echoes of labor and intimacy, the rhythm of life pressed into every surface, the careful stacking of stones, the sweep of brooms across cold flagstones, the hushed conversations of women, the measured steps of soldiers in training, the laughter of children chasing each other across worn surfaces. And though these sounds are no longer present, their essence remains, absorbed into the very architecture, released intermittently through wind, through light, through the observer's awareness, so that presence and memory intertwine, and one senses the sacred continuum that binds generations. The subtle dialogue between the living and the long departed, the tangible and the unseen. The battlements are repositories of human paradox, capturing both courage and fear, tenderness and violence, hope and despair, each stone reflecting the duality of existence, the wind threading through broken crenellations, like an organ playing a single note, a hymn of endurance that carries across valleys and hills, threading together countless gestures of care, devotion, and sorrow, teaching that history is neither linear nor singular, but a mosaic of private truths, fleeting glances, whispered promises, silent prayers, and ordinary acts that, when compounded, shape the essence of life, the stone absorbing these moments as faithfully as parchment holds ink. The highlands themselves becoming sacred custodians of this intangible archive. The light shifts subtly as morning progresses, casting long, meditative shadows across battlements and collapsed walls. The wind carrying the faint pulse of past lives through broken staircases and archways, stirring moss and dust like a delicate dance. And in this ephemeral movement, one senses the rhythm of human persistence, the sacred patterns embedded in gesture, labor, and devotion. The quiet heroism of daily life pressed into stone, preserved in air, and made perceptible to those who move slowly, listen attentively, and honor the delicate interplay of presence and memory. Understanding that endurance is sacred, and that fleeting acts of care and courage leave traces that outlast even the strongest stone. The battlements teach patience and reverence, guiding the observer's gaze outward to distant hills, lochs, and valleys, emphasizing both the vastness of the land and the subtle significance of human action. The wind moving through arches and parapets with a persistent yet gentle insistence, carrying scents of earth and peat, echoes of steps and voices, impressions of fleeting joy and sorrow, and in these currents, one perceives the sacred dialogue between time, stone, and human experience, a resonance that shapes consciousness, teaching that history is a living force, present not only in books or artifacts, but in the quiet pulse of architecture, wind, and landscape. Every corner of the battlements speaks in its own language, the collapsed staircases hinting at struggles endured, the weathered towers at vigilance maintained, the narrow passages at intimate human connection. And to wander these spaces is to witness a complex choreography of existence, the observer, becoming both participant and vessel, sensing the ebb and flow of human lives, the tender and heroic, the fleeting and enduring, all layered upon each other like waves pressed into stone, carried forward in the subtle currents of wind and light, teaching that memory is not passive but active, a living dialogue between past and present. Evenings drape the battlements in a muted palette of violet and copper, the wind moving in soft, persistent streams, carrying the scent of moss, whetstone, and lingering fires. And in this hour, the intimate traces of life become almost visible, the press of hands on walls, the tilt of heads in conversation, the careful tending of hearth and garden, all preserved as impressions in the architecture, the mist, and the observer's consciousness, revealing that the sacredness of life is not in grandeur but in persistence, devotion, and the subtle accumulation of care over time. A quiet testimony pressed into stone and wind. The architecture itself embodies memory, guiding the eye and the imagination, framing vistas of valleys, lochs, and distant mountains, while simultaneously containing the layered histories of human existence. Each scar a narrative, each fracture a lesson, each repair a testament to devotion. The battlements acting as conduits for reflection and remembrance, their geometry and decay forming a sacred language, readable not with eyes alone but with attention, empathy, and presence, teaching that endurance and care leave impressions far beyond the ephemeral span of individual life. As night deepens, the battlements rest beneath a vast expanse of starlit sky, wind sighing gently through broken arches and staircases, carrying the pulse of countless lives, the quiet rhythm of human persistence pressed into stone and air, the lingering fragrance of earth, pine, and heather, and one feels simultaneously humble and connected, understanding that these walls, though crumbled, remain sacred repositories of experience, urging reverence, teaching that memory persists, and guiding the observer into a state of awareness in which the past and present converge, subtle, mournful, beautiful, and eternal. Morning light drifts softly across the highland battlements, brushing fractured towers and moss-covered walls with a gentle caress, the wind threading through crumbled crenellations, like a delicate, unseen hand, carrying the faint perfume of wet earth, pine, and ancient fires. And in this fragile hour, the past is palpable, pressing gently against skin and consciousness, each stone vibrating with the memory of lives lived here. The rhythm of daily existence pressed into every surface, the quiet courage and tenderness of those who built, defended, and cherished these spaces. The subtle acts of care and devotion layered into the very fabric of the battlements, creating a sacred archive of human persistence. Every stair, corridor, and courtyard is etched with the invisible presence of those who passed through. The careful stacking of stones, the sweep of brooms, the hushed murmur of conversations, the laughter of children, the soft ministrations of care, gestures of love and protection, all absorbed into the architecture, released intermittently through wind, light, and observation, so that those who linger become witnesses to continuity. The sacred dialogue between the living and the departed, a subtle communion in which time folds upon itself and memory becomes tangible, carried in the pulse of stone and the breath of wind. The battlements are chronicles of duality, capturing the fragile balance of human existence, courage and fear, tenderness and violence, hope and despair, each scar and fracture a testament, each careful repair a hymn to perseverance. The wind moving through arches and parapets like a whispering cantor, scattering impressions across valleys and lochs, weaving the private narratives of love, sorrow, devotion, and quiet heroism into the enduring fabric of the highlands, teaching that the essence of history is never singular, but a complex, sacred mosaic pressed into stone and air, and accessible to those willing to observe with patience and reverences. Sunlight shifts throughout the day, shadows lengthen and contract, revealing the delicate textures of stone, the subtle indentations of past presence, the faint traces of countless acts, small and profound, the press of hands upon surfaces, the measured steps of soldiers, the laughter of children, the hushed exchanges of lovers, the whispered prayers of the faithful, all preserved in architecture and atmosphere, and the observer, walking slowly, becomes part of this continuum, sensing the sacred rhythm of human persistence and the endurance of memory through centuries, the silent yet eloquent testimony of ordinary lives pressed into the extraordinary canvas of landscape and stone. The battlements are more than ruins. They are repositories of identity, memory, and collective experience, each scar reflecting the fragility and strength of life. The fleeting and enduring, the intimate and monumental, the wind threading through cracks and gaps like a conduit, carrying impressions, scents, echoes of laughter and lament, lessons in perseverance and devotion, teaching that every act of care, attention, and courage leaves traces that endure far beyond the span of individual life. And that sacredness resides not in grandeur alone, but in the subtle accumulation of presence. Over time, evening arrives with muted, sacred tones. The battlements bathed in copper and violet, the wind threading gently through archways and broken staircases, carrying the faint pulse of centuries of human life. The lingering scent of moss and stone, the subtle echo of footsteps long vanished, and one perceives the sacredness in both endurance and impermanence, the quiet beauty of fragility preserved in stone and memory, the intimate choreography of daily existence pressed into architecture and atmosphere, forming a living, breathing testament to the persistence of care, devotion, and resilience. The architecture itself is a teacher, guiding eye and mind outward to distant hills, lochs, and valleys, while simultaneously containing the intricate layering of human experience, each fracture and repair a narrative, each shadow and light pattern a lesson in reverence and reflection. The battlements forming a language of endurance, perceptible not only to the eyes but to attentive presence, teaching that the sacred resides in observation, empathy, and the careful attention to the subtle marks left by those who came before, and that human presence, though fleeting, can ripple through centuries' knit falls. And the battlements are cloaked in a soft indigo, stars reflected in distant locks, the wind moving like a slow sacred hymn through towers and collapsed walls, carrying impressions of countless lives, small acts of courage and tenderness, whispers of devotion and sorrow, the lingering essence of human presence pressed into stone and air. And the observer feels simultaneously humbled and connected, aware of the continuum of generations, the sacred interplay of presence and absence, the endurance of memory, the rhythm of lives lived fully in the shadow of impermanence, teaching that to witness is itself a sacred act, and that the wind will carry the song of these battlements forever. And so the battlements, wind-worn and eternal, hold their vigil, patient and sacred, their stories pressed into stone and air, waiting for those who pause to listen, to feel, to touch, to honor. The centuries of human persistence vibrating softly beneath feet and fingertips, the wind carrying whispers of love, courage, sorrow, and devotion across the highlands, guiding the observer into reverence and awe, teaching that history, memory, and the sacred are inseparable, and that every attentive presence contributes to the ongoing, unbroken continuum of remembrance. The highlands settle into late afternoon, the light softening into a golden haze that drapes over the wind-worn battlements. And in this luminous stillness, the past is nearly palpable, pressing against skin and consciousness, the scent of damp stone, pine, and heather infused with centuries of human presence, the wind carrying whispers of countless lives folded into these walls, their courage, sorrow, tenderness, and devotion pressed into every fracture and arch, creating a living archive that moves through air and stone, waiting for those patient enough to feel the subtle resonance of memory, the sacred hum of enduring human presence. The battlements themselves are more than ruins. They are chronicles, vessels of memory, each scar a verse, each collapse a testament, each careful repair a hymn. The wind threading through crenellations like an invisible hand, lifting dust, moss, and fragments of history to carry them across valleys and locks, scattering them into the rhythm of the landscape. And the observer becomes part of this sacred exchange, walking slowly, sensing the pulse of countless gestures, hands smoothing stones, sweeping courtyards, lifting children, whispering prayers, tilting heads in conversational, pressed into the architecture and into the very air, forming a subtle, sacred melody of endurance. Every staircase, every tower, every courtyard is etched with dualities, courage and fear, hope and despair, tenderness and violence, acts of devotion and silent heroism, moments often invisible to history books, yet indelibly present in stone and wind, the battlements absorbing these rhythms as faithfully as parchment holds ink, teaching that sacredness is found not only in grandeur but in the delicate persistence of ordinary life, the quiet layering of memory through centuries, the slow accumulation of human presence, pressed into architecture and landscape, a continuity both fragile and enduring. The shifting light traces the textures of weathered stone, highlighting fissures and chips, illuminating corners where children once played, soldiers trained, mothers prayed, and lovers whispered each moment, preserved as impression and memory. The wind carrying these histories in currents that touch the observer subtly yet persistently, and one feels the intimate pulse of lives long vanished, the sacred resonance of human endeavor, the quiet dignity of endurance, teaching that presence itself becomes sacred when imbued with attention, care, and reverence, and that memory thrives. In spaces both material and atmospheric, evening descends with muted grace, the battlements glowing softly beneath a sky of copper and violet, the wind threading gently through arches and broken staircases, carrying the faint pulse of lives that shaped this place, the subtle fragrance of moss, stone, and lingering smoke rising to meet it, and one perceives the delicate traces of existence, hands pressed to walls, footsteps along worn corridors, whispered prayers, gestures of care, expressions of joy and sorrow, all vibrating in the air and stone, forming a sacred, unbroken continuum of human presence, teaching that memory is not static, but fluid, sacred, and enduring. The battlements guide the observer's gaze, framing distant hills, lochs, and valleys, emphasizing the vastness of the land, the subtle significance of individual gestures, and the sacred dialogue between human effort and elemental persistence, wind and stone interwoven with care, devotion, and remembrance. A continuum that transcends centuries, the architecture a teacher of resilience, endurance, and the enduring impact of small acts, each scar, fracture, and repair a narrative that continues to resonate, revealing that the sacred is embedded in observation, attention, and the quiet preservation of human presence as darkness approaches. The battlements rest beneath a vast indigo sky, scattered with stars reflected in distant lochs, the wind sighing softly through towers and collapsed walls, carrying impressions of lives lived fully, of courage, tenderness, sorrow, and devotion, and one feels humbled yet connected, aware of the sacred continuum of generations, the interplay of presence and absence, the persistence of memory, and the quiet beauty of endurance pressed into stone and air, teaching that to witness these spaces is itself an act of reverence, and that history, memory, and the sacred flow continuously through time. The wind-worn battlements, patient and eternal, hold their vigil as centuries pass. The stories of lives lived and lost pressed into every surface, waiting for those who pause to hear and feel, to honor and remember, guiding the observer into awe and introspection, teaching that sacredness resides in the continuum of care, attention, and presence, and that memory persists, subtle, mournful, and beautiful, carried in wind and stone, reaching forward as gently as it reaches backward, offering a bridge between past and present, between the seen and unseen, between fragility and endurance. And so, as twilight deepens and the highlands exhale in the hush of night, the battlements, fractured yet dignified, continue their sacred watch, whispering their accumulated histories. To the wind, their silent lessons carried over valleys, hills, and lochs, inviting reverence, awareness, and memory, reminding all who listen that the past is never gone, the human pulse endures, and the sacred rhythm of life, loss, and devotion remains eternal, woven into the fabric of stone, wind, and imagination. Night has fully embraced the highlands, folding the wind-worn battlements into shadows that mingle with the distant glow of starlight reflected upon lochs. And in this serene darkness, the past whispers most clearly, each stone vibrating with the accumulated weight of lives that shaped these spaces. Their courage, tenderness, sorrow, and devotion pressed into every fracture and arch. The wind threading through parapets and broken staircases like a sacred chant, carrying invisible impressions across valleys and hills, weaving a subtle hymn of endurance, memory, and reverence that resonates quietly within the heart of the observer. The battlements, though fractured and softened by centuries, retained their dignity, their towers standing like patient sentinels over the land, framing distant hills, lochs, and valleys, the wind carrying scents of wet stone, moss, pine, and lingering peat smoke. And in this tapestry of perception, one feels the intimate pulse of generations. The rhythm of lives lived fully despite impermanence, the sacred layering of human effort, care, and devotion pressed into stone and air, a continuum that binds past and present, seen and unseen, sorrow and joy, fleeting gestures and enduring endurance. Every archway, staircase, and courtyard holds echoes of the ordinary and extraordinary, the press of hands, the measured steps of soldiers, the laughter of children, the hushed prayers of mothers, the tender gestures of lovers, all absorbed into the architecture and released through wind, light, and attention. The battlements acting as living archives of human presence, their subtle language of memory legible only to those who move slowly, listen deeply, and honor the quiet pulse of history embedded in stone, mist, and air, teaching that sacredness is inseparable from care, observation, and reverence. The wind continues its patient circulation, lifting dust, moss, and tiny fragments of history like motes of light, carrying them across valleys and hills, threading through broken crenellations, and pressing against the observer with a gentle insistence. And in this movement, one senses the continuum of human endeavor, the sacred resonance of lives lived in courage, tenderness, and devotion. The accumulation of ordinary acts pressed into the extraordinary architecture of endurance. A subtle instruction that memory is active, alive, and present in the very fabric of the world. Light, shadow, and wind conspire to reveal layers of meaning embedded in the battlements. The fractured stone and collapsed towers framing vistas of eternal landscape, while simultaneously containing intimate histories of love, sorrow, courage, and care. Each scar, fissure, and repair a narrative, each subtle trace a verse in the sacred hymn of human persistence. And the observer, attuned to these details, participates in this living dialogue, sensing the sacred rhythm of existence and the enduring beauty of memory pressed into stone, air, and the pulse of the highlands as midnight deepens. The battlements rest beneath a sky strewn with stars, the wind sighing softly through parapets and corridors, carrying impressions of countless lives. The quiet rhythm of human presence pressing against time, teaching that endurance is not measured by grandeur alone, but by subtle, sustained acts of care, attention, and devotion, the sacred persistence of ordinary gestures that ripple through centuries, leaving traces visible not in monuments but in the texture of stone. The pattern of wind, the lingering scent of earth and moss, and the quiet pulse of memory. The battlements, patient and eternal, hold the stories of generations in their stones and arches, in the wind that threads through broken staircases, the mist that drifts along ramparts, the subtle textures of moss and earth, waiting for observers who pause to honor their sacred rhythm, teaching that history is never gone, memory persists, and the sacred is found in awareness, reverence, and the quiet recognition of lives lived fully, tenderly, courageously, and with devotion, pressed into the continuum of time and space. Even as the wind fades and night deepens. The battlements maintain their vigil, their fractured towers and crumbling walls, a sacred archive of human persistence, the echoes of love, sorrow, courage, and devotion vibrating softly in stone and air, reaching forward into the present, inviting reverence, contemplation, and memory, teaching that to witness these spaces is to participate in the sacred continuum of generations, a communion with both the fleeting and the enduring, the visible and the invisible, the ephemeral and the eternal. And so, our journey through the wind-worn battlements of the Scottish Highlands comes to an end. But history is never silent. It whispers to those who listen, and it waits for those who dare to return. And in our next voyage, we will step into the ancient monasteries of Ireland, another chapter carved into the stones of time. Until then, may the echoes of the past follow you into your dreams, and may you wake ready for the next legend. Good night.